In the first week of March 1935, neighbors broke into a frozen cabin beside a played-out silver mine above Leadville, Colorado, and found the body of an old woman on the floor, her arms folded across her chest, the fire long dead beside her. Her name was Elizabeth Tabor, and 50 years before, the newspapers had called her the best-dressed woman in the West. Her husband, Horace Tabor, had been the Silver King, the richest man in Colorado, who built his fortune on $17 of bacon and flour, sold a single mining claim for $1 million, owned the Matchless Mine when it paid as much as $80,000 a month, raised 2 opera houses, a bank, and a grand hotel, and bought himself 30 days in the United States Senate. He married her in a Washington wedding attended by the President of the United States. Then, inside a single year, 1893, all of it came apart, and the metal that had made the Tabors unmade them. He died telling her to hold on to the Matchless. She held on for 36 years, until the night the fire went out. For 100 years, Horace Tabor was remembered as a self-made man. By the end of this story, you may agree, or you may decide, the whole fortune was luck, and that he earned none of it. Watch to the finish, then tell us in the comments which one he was. Chapter 1. The Stonecutter. The road to that frozen cabin began 3/4 of a century earlier and 2,000 miles to the east, in the stone country of northern Vermont. Horace Austin Warner Tabor was born in November of 1830 on a hill farm near Holland, a few miles short of the Canadian border, the son of a farmer who kept the district school through the long winters. As a young man, he left for the granite and marble quarries of Massachusetts and Maine, where he cut stone for wages and learned the only trade he would carry west into the mountains, the patience of a man who works hard, rock, and waits. His employer in Maine was a quarry owner named William Pierce. It was Pierce's daughter, Augusta, whom Tabor went back east to marry in 1857. Augusta Pierce was the more formidable of the two, and for the better part of 20 years she was the reason the family survived. She was thrifty where her husband was open-handed, doubting where he was hopeful. In 1855, Tabor had joined a company of anti-slavery settlers bound for the Kansas Territory, homesteading a stretch of deep creek in Riley County that still carries the name Tabor Valley, and serving in the renegade Free Soil legislature during the years the territory earned the name Bleeding Kansas. Then, in 1859, word of gold in the western reaches of the territory reached the prairie, and the Tabors loaded an ox-drawn wagon and joined the 59ers, streaming toward the Rocky Mountains and the Pikes Peak rush. What followed was 18 years of disappointment dressed as opportunity. They tried the diggings at California Gulch near a raw camp called Oro City, where the placer gold ran out almost as fast as the men arrived. They moved to South Park and a settlement that would later be called Buckskin Joe. Everywhere they stopped, the pattern repeated. Horace took his pick into the hills to prospect, while Augusta opened a store, took in boarders, did the cooking and the laundry, and handled the mail when her husband was named postmaster. The mining rarely paid. The store, run by Augusta, usually did. By the early 1860s, the family had scraped together a modest competence, and almost all of it had come from her ledger rather than his shovel. This is the part of the legend that the legend leaves out. The man Colorado would crown the Bonanza King of Leadville, the self-made silver baron held up for a century as proof of what grit and the frontier could make of a poor stonecutter, had by his middle 40s dug a great many holes and struck very little. 18 years of prospecting had produced a country store and a tired wife. Whatever was about to lift Horace Tabor to a Denver mansion and a seat in the Senate It would not be skill, and it would not be his own two hands. It would be a pair of strangers, a sack of provisions, and a hill of gray rock that almost no one wanted. And it would happen in the new camp the Tabors had just moved back to, the camp the whole country was about to learn to call Leadville. Chapter 2. Cloud City. By the time the Tabors came back to California Gulch in 1877, the Gulch had already been left for dead once. Nearly 2 decades earlier, the placer miners had washed the gravel for gold and moved on when it thinned, cursing the heavy black sand that clogged their sluice boxes and slowed the work. For years, that sand had been treated as a nuisance and thrown aside. Then someone carried a sample to an assayer, and the result rearranged the map of the West. The black grit the gold men had been shoveling out of their way was kerosite, a lead carbonate run through with silver. The waste was the fortune. The men who had spent years chasing gold had been standing on a mountain of silver the entire time. Word of that reversal emptied half of Colorado into the upper Arkansas Valley. The camp that rose on the flats below the tree line was first called Slab Town, for the rough green planks its first cabins were thrown together from, and then, when the residents petitioned Washington for a post office, it was given the name of the metal that made it. They called it Leadville. Horace Tabor helped lay out its streets alongside a young smelter man named August Meyer, opened a general store on the new Harrison Avenue, and in January of 1878 was elected the first mayor of a town that barely existed. He was postmaster as well, which meant that almost every man in camp passed through his door for his mail, his flour, his credit, or his poker table. What that door looked out on in those first 2 years has few equals in the history of the American West. Leadville sat 2 miles above the sea, at better than 10,000 feet, the highest incorporated city in the country, a place where the winters were long and lethal and men froze in the streets. And into that thin, freezing air the country poured itself. By 1880, the federal census counted some 15,000 residents, though at the height of the rush, the camp claimed more than 30,000. Smelters ringed the town, working its lead-silver ore into bullion around the clock. There were 28 miles of graded streets, gas lamps, water mains, hospitals, banks, and a brick schoolhouse built for 1,100 children. And by the count of the 1879 city directory, there were also 120 saloons, 118 gambling houses, and 35 brothels, set against a grand total of 4 churches. It was a place that took an unusual pride in its own wickedness. The dance halls ran all night, and a Leadville newspaper of the era, the Colorado Miner, described them without affection as breathing holes of hell where customers imbibe torchlight whiskey and indulge in the quadrille and the whirling sinuosities of the waltz. Above the piano of one saloon hung a sign that became famous across the West, a small monument to the town's standards. "Please do not shoot the pianist. He is doing his best." Men were knifed over card games, and the violence ran so high that Tabor's hired marshal, Mart Dugan, earned a permanent place in Colorado memory, facing down lynch mobs from the jailhouse door. This was the camp Horace Tabor presided over, mayor, postmaster, storekeeper, and the most prosperous merchant on the richest hill in America. He was, by the standard of the diggings, a successful man at last. After 18 lean years, he owned a thriving store, held public office, and carried a comfortable balance. Had nothing further happened, he would be a footnote in the county histories, a frontier shopkeeper who did well. But Horace Tabor had a habit that his careful wife had warned him against for 2 decades, a small, open-handed habit that cost a few dollars at a time and almost always came to nothing. He grubstaked prospectors. He fronted them food and tools on their way back into the hills in exchange for a share of whatever they might find, which was, almost without exception, nothing at all. In the spring of 1878, two of them walked into his store who could not pay for their provisions. They were cobblers by trade and knew almost nothing about mining. No one else in Leadville would stake them. Tabor, against every instinct his wife possessed, agreed. Chapter 3. $17. What Tabor handed them was almost nothing. $17 in flour, bacon, coffee, and a few tools that first day, and more on two later visits, some $60 in all, advanced against a one-third share of anything the two men might find. It was the kind of small, hopeful loss Augusta had watched her husband take for 20 years, and she had stopped expecting it to come to anything. By one account set down afterward, when August Risch first brought word back to the store, he was waved off with a line that survived into the legend, "Risch, when you bring me money instead of rocks, then I'll believe you." The two cobblers climbed Friar Hill, chose a spot more or less at random, and began to sink a shaft. Less than 30 feet down, they cut into a body of silver carbonate so rich it beggared belief. They named the claim the Little Pittsburgh, and by the early days of May, 1878, the strike had set off what the country would remember as the Colorado Silver Boom. The mine those two men had no business finding began to pour out as much as $20,000 a week. The century-long legend was built to soften this very detail. Horace Tabor did not earn the largest fortune in Colorado through skill or geology or grit. He earned it by extending $17 of groceries to two failed shoemakers who knew nothing about mining and dug where they happened to stop. The frontier myth would dress him afterward as the self-made man, proof of what nerve and hard work could pull out of a mountain. The truth was simpler and stranger. The richest man in the territory was the luckiest, and very little more. The enrichment, once it began, moved at a speed that strained belief. A storekeeper worth perhaps a few $1,000s in 1877 was, by the end of 1878, one of the wealthiest men in Colorado and the newly elected lieutenant governor of the state. The Little Pittsburgh paid him $20,000 a week. In the autumn of 1879, he sold his one-third interest in it for $1 million. He turned and bought the Matchless Mine outright for $117,000. Within roughly 18 months, a man who had spent 18 years finding nothing had passed from the back of a grocery store to a Denver mansion, and he had done none of the digging. And here the story of pure luck takes on a harder edge. Tabor did not merely stumble into riches. He and his partners understood exactly when to leave. He had held the Little Pittsburgh alongside two of the most powerful men in the territory, the United States Senator Jerome Chaffee and the financier David Moffett, names that still mark Colorado's map. As 1879 drew to a close and the richest ore began to thin, the three of them kept up a public show of confidence, floated the mine's shares to investors in the East, and quietly sold out at the top. The speculators who bought in watched those shares slide from $65 to $6. Tabor's next bonanza, the chrysolite, taken up with the Chicago merchant Marshall Field, ran the same course, its stock collapsing from above $40 to $4. The luck was real. So was the timing. The Matchless was the one he kept. Of all the claims he bought and sold across the silver country, from Leadville to Aspen to the San Juan Mountains, it was the only great mine he owned entirely and alone, and for a few years its name was no exaggeration. At its height, the Matchless paid as much as $80,000 a month, a river of silver running into the hands of a man who, 2 years earlier, had been weighing flour for miners on credit. It is the mine he would order his wife, 2 decades later, never under any circumstance to sell. It is the mine beside which she would be found frozen on a cabin floor. But all of that lay far ahead, unimaginable in the flush of the boom. For now, there was only the question that the suddenly rich have always had to answer, and that Horace Tabor was singularly unequipped to answer well. What a stone-cutter does with a fortune he never expected and could not quite count. He gave it almost no thought at all. He simply began to spend, on a scale Colorado had never seen, and the first thing he chose to build would put his name in gold letters across the grandest stage between Chicago and San Francisco. Chapter 4. The Silver King. He built first in Leadville. In the autumn of 1879, in something close to 100 days, he raised the Tabor Opera House on Harrison Avenue, a 3-story brick house of culture with frescoed ceilings and gas footlights, set down in the middle of a camp that still settled its arguments with knives. It was called the finest theater between St. Louis and the Pacific, and for a mining town at 10,000 feet, it nearly was. 3 years later, the visiting Irish writer Oscar Wilde would stand on its stage in velvet and knee breeches and lecture Leadville's silver miners on the principles of interior decoration, an evening that says almost everything about what the boom had suddenly made possible. But Leadville was only the rehearsal. By the early 1880s, Tabor had moved the household down to Denver, and there he set out to build something that would carry his name into the next century. The Tabor Grand Opera House opened on the 5th of September, 1881, at a cost reported near $750,000, and no extravagance was spared in it. The seats and boxes were cut from Japanese cherry and Honduras mahogany. A rotunda roofed in stained glass ran 70 feet by 20. The lobby held 2 immense mirrors and a frescoed ceiling. Crimson Wilton carpet climbed the stairs, and the stage stretched 72 feet wide and 50 deep behind an enormous painted curtain. It was on that curtain that the Silver King left, without intending to, the truest thing ever said about him. Across the great drop hung 4 lines of verse, lines often credited to the English writer Charles Kingsley, chosen for their grandeur and never once read for their warning, "So fleet the works of men back to the earth again, ancient and holy things fade like a dream." Tabor hung those words above his own monument at the height of his glory. Within 15 years, every word of them would come true at his expense. For the moment, though, the works of men were rising, not fading, and they were rising everywhere with his name on them. The scale of what Horace Tabor built in barely 4 years still reads like a fever. The Leadville Opera House went up in 100 days. The Denver Opera House, the finest west of the Mississippi, cost $750,000. Beside it stood the 5-story Tabor Block, an office building faced in cast iron and Italian marble. There was the Tabor Grand Hotel, counted among the best hotels in the West, and the Bank of Leadville, and mansions in 2 cities, and mining interests scattered from Aspen to the San Juans to the deserts of the Southwest. A man who had spent 18 years unable to pay his own way had, in less than half a decade, stamped his name across the skyline of a state. The name went on to the ballot as well. In 1878, Colorado had made him lieutenant governor. He served until 1883, commanded and personally bankrolled militia companies that paraded in uniforms he paid for, and let it be known that what he truly wanted was a seat in the United States Senate. Money, he had begun to assume, could purchase that as it had purchased everything else. He was generous, expansive, and increasingly convinced that the luck which had lifted him was a kind of merit. He gave to the town, endowed its institutions, and signed his name with a flourish to buildings he would not live to keep. There was only one person in Colorado the gold left entirely unmoved, and she was the person who had earned the first of it. While Horace filled opera houses and reviewed his private cavalry, Augusta Tabor kept the accounts in her head and watched the spending with a New England dread she could not make him feel. She had panned the campfires and boiled the laundry through 18 lean years. She knew, as he seemed unable to learn, how quickly a Colorado fortune could rise and how much faster it could fall. The grander his monuments grew, the more plainly the marriage beneath them was coming apart, and it would take only a striking young woman, newly arrived and newly divorced, to finish what the money had begun. Chapter 5. The Marriage Cracks. The cracks had been there from the first day of the fortune. In January of 1879, flush with little Pittsburgh money, Horace bought one of the grandest houses in Denver, the mansion of Henry Brown at 17th and Broadway, and paid $40,000 for it. Brown was the man who would later raise the Brown Palace Hotel and give the city the ground its capital stands on, and his house was a statement of arrival. When Horace brought Augusta to see it, she did not admire the staircase or the grounds. She had lived through too many Colorado fortunes to believe in this one, and she answered him in a sentence he should have written down and kept. "I will never go up these steps, Tabor, if you think I will ever have to go down them." It was not the timidity of a frightened woman. It was the judgment of the one person who had been present for every dollar, and who understood the arithmetic of the mountains better than the man getting rich off them. Augusta Pierce Tabor had cooked for boarders, washed miners' laundry, kept the store and the post office, and carried the family on her own labor through 18 years when her husband's pick brought home nothing. She did not fear hard times because she had never really left them. What she feared was a fortune spent as though it could not end, and a husband who had begun to mistake luck for wisdom. So she went on economizing inside a palace. She turned down the lamps, watched the household bills, and declined to play the great lady while her husband bought opera houses and uniforms for his private cavalry. To Horace, freshly remade as the Silver King and hungry to look the part, her thrift was no longer a virtue. It was an embarrassment. She was plain where the new world he moved in prized polish, frugal where it prized display, and aging alongside him, a reminder in the corner of every gilded room of the cold camps he was trying to forget. The partnership that had built the fortune became, in his eyes, an obstacle to enjoying it. By the summer of 1880, the distance had hardened into separation. Horace moved out of the 17th Street mansion, leaving Augusta in it, and took rooms at the Windsor Hotel, the most fashionable house in Denver. There he could keep his own hours and his own company, and there, before long, he would install the company he had begun to prefer. Augusta remained behind in the great empty house she had warned him against, a near recluse among the furnishings of a marriage that was over in every way but the legal one. And on the legal one she would not move. Horace wanted to be free, and Augusta, for reasons that were partly principle and partly pride, and partly a refusal to be discarded like a worn-out coat, would not give him a divorce. She had been his wife for more than 20 years, through the lean ones that no one now remembered, and she did not intend to be erased from the record of his life simply because he had grown rich enough to want a newer one. For 3 years she held that line. Her refusal would force her husband into the backcountry courtroom maneuver and the secret marriage that turned a private cruelty into a public scandal, and that handed the newspapers of 2 cities the story they had been waiting for. Because by then there was a name attached to Horace Tabor's restlessness, and it was not Augusta's. She had arrived in Colorado a few years earlier as the young bride of a failing miner, had divorced him for his failures, and had drifted into Leadville with little more than her looks and her nerve. The miners there had given her a nickname that followed her the rest of her life and into legend. They called her Baby Doe. Chapter 6. Baby Doe. She had been born Elizabeth McCourt in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, on the 7th of October, 1854, the daughter of an Irish Catholic clothier, and from girlhood she had been the kind of beauty that a room rearranged itself around. In 1877, she married a young man named Harvey Doe, whose father held a half-interest in a Colorado gold mine, and the newlyweds went west to the camp of Central City to work it. It was the first of the disappointments. Harvey could not make the mine pay, could not hold a position, and drank. And Elizabeth, who had crossed half a continent on the strength of his prospects, found herself yoked to a man every bit as luckless as Augusta's husband had once been, and a great deal weaker. In the rough little camp, the miners took to calling her Baby Doe, a name half affectionate and half a remark on how young and out of place this striking woman looked among the slag heaps. The name was the most durable thing Harvey Doe ever gave her. It would follow her for 50 years, onto the front pages and into the operas, long after he was forgotten. By the late 1870s, the marriage was collapsing. Harvey drifted away when he was needed most, and Baby Doe leaned on the kindness of a young clothing merchant named Jacob Sands, who saw her through the worst of it. The worst of it came in the summer of 1879. Pregnant and nearly destitute, abandoned again by her husband, she gave birth on the 13th of July to a son who did not live. It was Jake Sands, not Harvey Doe, who made the arrangements and paid what had to be paid. Whatever else the world would later say about Baby Doe, the trophy wife of legend, the schemer who stole another woman's husband, there is a single artifact that cuts through all of it. Among her papers, found only after her own death more than 50 years later, was a scrapbook, and pressed into it with dried flowers around the words was a note in her own hand. My baby boy, born July 13th, 1879, had dark, dark hair, very curly, large, blue eyes. He was lovely, Baby Doe. She carried that grief, folded and private, through every year of the splendor and every year of the ruin that followed. In 1880 she gave up on Harvey for good, divorced him, and went where everyone in Colorado with nothing left to lose was going. She went to Leadville. Jake Sands, opening a new store in the boomtown, found her a place in a boarding house and let it be known that he would marry her if she liked. She did not love him, and the question soon became academic, because in Leadville she met the richest and most powerful man in the state. The meeting between Horace Tabor and Baby Doe has been told 100 ways, but every version agrees on the essential fact, which is that it was immediate and total on both sides. He was 49 and the Silver King. She was 25 and luminous, with the kind of face the photographs of the period still cannot quite contain. He was, in every legal sense, a married man, his wife shut up in a Denver mansion 2 days' travel away. None of it slowed him for an instant. He installed Baby Doe in a fine suite at the Clarendon Hotel, the house that stood beside his own opera theater in Leadville, and was joined to it, conveniently, by a covered bridge. For a while the arrangement wore the thin disguise of discretion. It did not last. Tabor was too proud of her, and too used to having whatever he wanted, to hide it for long, and Baby Doe was not a woman who could pass through a room unnoticed. Their attachment became the open talk of two cities, the Silver King and his beautiful divorcee, while the wife who had built his first fortune kept her silence and her refusal in Denver. What had begun as a private betrayal was hardening into a public one, and Horace Tabor, who believed his money could arrange anything, now set about arranging the one thing it could not buy, cleanly, a way to marry the woman he wanted while he was still, in the eyes of the law and the church, married to the woman he did not. Chapter 7. The Silver Wedding. The obstacle was Augusta, and Augusta would not move. So Horace went around her. In the spring of 1882, he slipped down to Durango, in the far southwest corner of the state, and obtained a quiet divorce in a back-country court, a decree Augusta neither consented to nor knew about, and one no honest lawyer would later call valid. Then, in September of that year in St. Louis, he secretly married Baby Doe, although by every sound reading of the law, he was still married to his first wife. For a few months, the Silver King of Colorado was, in plain terms, a bigamist. Only in early 1883, with Augusta at last suing for divorce in a Denver courtroom, did Horace move to marry Baby Doe a second time, in the open and as spectacle. Augusta, for her part, came away with a settlement that left her the mansion and a fortune of her own. He had the stage for it, too, because in that same season he had finally reached the edge of the office he craved. Colorado's Senator Henry Teller had resigned his seat to join President Arthur's cabinet, and the legislature needed someone to keep the chair warm for the 30 days remaining in the term. They gave the scrap to Tabor. He had wanted 6 years in the United States Senate. He was handed 30 days, a caretaker's appointment, the political equivalent of a courtesy nod. A more self-aware man might have taken it quietly. Horace Tabor took it to Washington and threw a wedding. The numbers tell the rest. To stage the marriage, Tabor had effectively purchased a 30-day Senate seat. The bride wore a satin gown that cost $7,000, $250,000 in today's money, now the prize of a museum collection in Denver. At her throat hung a diamond necklace, the papers valued at anywhere from $75,000 to $500,000, said on no good evidence to hold gems Queen Isabella had once pawned to send Columbus across the ocean. The reception filled the finest hotel in the capital, and the guest of honor, seated among the senators on the 1st of March, 1883, at the Willard Hotel, was the President of the United States, Chester Arthur himself, who came with his cabinet to watch the Silver Baron marry his divorcee. But the guilt cracked even on the day. The President's cabinet came. Not one of their wives would attend the remarriage of two divorced Catholics. And 2 days after the ceremony, the priest who had performed it, on learning that both bride and groom carried divorces behind them, and that he had been told less than the truth, refused to sign the marriage certificate and would have nothing further to do with it. The grandest wedding the West had ever financed had been disowned within 48 hours by the church that blessed it. The press was no gentler. Word of the Durango maneuver and the Washington display traveled fast, and the editorial pages treated Horace Tabor as a vulgar man who had confused money with merit. The records of his unsavory divorce suit are scarcely dry when he is married with vulgar display in Washington City, wrote the Cincinnati Enquirer. Closer to home, the Rocky Mountain Herald demanded that every respectable body in the country disown him. The newspapers had been handed exactly the story they wanted: the rich man, the cast-off wife, the beautiful interloper, and they ran it for all it was worth. None of it touched the couple at the center, who were, by every account, genuinely and stubbornly in love. They went home to Denver and lived as though the verdict did not apply to them. throwing lavish parties in the mansion Augusta had left, while the city's society quietly closed its doors. The doors mattered more than Horace understood. He had bought every other thing he wanted, the mines and the opera houses and the militia and the 30 days in the Senate, and he assumed, as he had always assumed, that respectability could be bought as well. It could not. Denver would take his money and decline his invitations, and the woman he had married would spend the next decade learning, in slights and silences, the exact difference between being rich and being received. For now, though, the Tabors were rich beyond accounting and defiant about it, and they set about doing the one thing the Gilded Age understood even better than making a fortune. They began, with both hands and no break of any kind, to spend it. Chapter 8. Society's Verdict. For a decade they lived as though silver could not run out. Horace kept the Denver mansion lit and busy, indulged his appetite for drink and cards and the kind of company a married man is not supposed to keep, and signed his name to one new venture after another. He dressed in black with diamond and onyx cuff buttons, and a Denver columnist of the day sketched him in print as a stoop-shouldered, balding man with an ambling gait, worth, the writer noted in the same breath, $8 million. The figure was thrown about the way the Gilded Age threw such figures, admiringly and without precision, and it was probably as close as anyone ever came to the truth. The marriage that scandalized Colorado produced 2 daughters, and the family poured its silver over them. The first, born in 1884, was Elizabeth, called Lily, as fair as her mother. The second arrived in 1889, and the story of her naming has been told ever since as a small parable of the age. By the account that gave the child her name, the silver champion William Jennings Bryan was visiting the house, heard the infant laugh, and said, "Why, Senator, that baby's laughter has the ring of a silver dollar." They christened her Rosemary Silver Dollar Echo Tabor, and Silver Dollar she stayed. 7 years later, Bryan would stand before the Democratic Convention and thunder that mankind should not be crucified upon a cross of gold, the great political cry of the silver men. But by then, the metal had already broken the family that had named a daughter for it. For all the money, the one thing Horace could not buy his wife was a single open door. Denver society had reached its verdict on Baby Doe and did not revise it. The respectable women of the city sent her no cards and accepted none. She was the divorcee who had broken a good wife's marriage, and no amount of Tabor silver would wash it off. She did not beg for acceptance. She gave generously and quietly to charities, and in 1893 she lent a room in the Tabor building to the National Women's Suffrage Association, of which she was a member, an act that did nothing to warm the city's conservatives toward her, and a good deal to complicate the legend of the grasping gold digger they preferred. Whatever Baby Doe was, she was nobody's ornament. She simply loved the wrong man at the wrong altitude of society and paid for it the rest of her life. 2 views of this marriage have always competed, and this is the place to choose between them. One sees a man brave enough to defy his whole world and marry the woman he truly loved. The other sees a husband who threw aside the faithful wife who had built his fortune the moment he could afford a younger one. Tell us in the comments which man you see. What almost no one paused to examine in those bright years was how much of the empire was real. The figures had a fever to them. Tabor's personal fortune was set by contemporaries at $8 or $9 million, and by some accounts a great deal more. The mining company, built on the little Pittsburgh alone, was valued at some $20 million. There were 2 opera houses, the finest hotel in 2 cities, a bank, the marble and iron Tabor block, mansions in Denver and Leadville, the Matchless pouring out its silver, and claims scattered from Aspen to Cripple Creek to the San Juans and down into the deserts of the Southwest. He was counted among the richest men in the United States, and not one person, very possibly including Horace Tabor himself, could have named within several $1,000,000 exactly what he was worth. That was the secret hiding inside all the gold leaf. The Tabor fortune was not a vault of coin. It was a tower of mines, mortgages, buildings, and paper, and every floor of it rested on a single assumption that silver would always be worth roughly what silver was worth in 1880. It was an assumption no one in Colorado controlled. The price of silver was set far from the matchless in the chambers of Congress and the counting houses of London by men who had never seen Friar Hill and owed the Tabors nothing. For 13 years the assumption held, and the family spent as though it always would. Then, in a single year, the men in those distant rooms changed their minds, and the entire tower came down at once. Chapter 9. The Trap. To understand how the Tabors lost everything in a single year, it is necessary to leave Colorado for a moment and follow the money to Washington, because the whole of the fortune rested on a question that no miner could answer. What exactly was a dollar made of? For most of the 19th century, the United States answered, both gold and silver. The government coined the two metals together and backed its paper money with both. And that arrangement, called bimetallism, was the floor beneath every silver mine in the West. As long as the United States stood ready to turn silver into money, silver had a guaranteed worth, and men like Horace Tabor were rich. The trouble was that the West dug up far more silver than the country could absorb. Colorado alone was soon producing better than half the nation's supply, and the more the mines pulled out of the ground, the less each ounce was worth. To hold the price up, the silver states leaned on Congress, and Congress obliged in stages. The Bland-Allison Act of 1878 had ordered the Treasury to buy a few $1,000,000 of silver every month. When that failed to stop the slide, the silver men won a far larger prop. On the 14th of July, 1890, President Harrison signed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, under which the United States Treasury was bound to buy 4.5 million ounces of silver every single month, very nearly the entire output of every American mine. The government had made itself the buyer of last resort for the metal that built Leadville. It should have saved the Tabors. Instead, it set the trap. The Treasury paid for its silver with paper notes that could be turned in for either gold or silver, at the holder's choice, and as confidence in silver fell, everyone who held those notes demanded gold. Month after month, the government bought silver it did not want, and paid out gold it could not spare, and the National Gold Reserve began to drain away like water from a cracked basin. By 1892, the country had elected Grover Cleveland, a hard-money man who despised the whole arrangement, and in 1893, the long-feared collapse arrived. Banks failed, railroads went under, and a genuine financial panic swept the country. Cleveland looked at the draining gold and concluded that the silver-buying law was bleeding the Treasury to death. He called Congress into special session, and in the autumn of 1893, the Sherman Act was repealed. The government simply stopped buying. The prop was kicked away, and the price of silver fell through the floor it had been holding up. What that meant on the ground can be measured. Silver, which had been coined as though it were worth $1.29 an ounce, sank toward 60. In one stretch of 4 days in 1893, it dropped from 83 cents to 62. After the repeal, the price fell by roughly a third more. Colorado, which mined some 60% of the country's silver, was destroyed first and worst. By July of 1893, about 45,000 Coloradans were out of work. 12 banks failed in Denver alone. More than 9,000 mining jobs vanished across the state, and Leadville, the richest hill in America, took the hardest blow of any town, with 90 of its mines shut and 2,500 men idle. Denver's population fell from 106,000 to 90,000 inside 5 years. By the end of that single year, some 3 million Americans had lost their work. The ruin did not respect rank. Henry Brown, the man who had sold Horace the Denver mansion and gone on to raise the great Brown Palace Hotel, could no longer pay his debts and lost the hotel that bore his name, and Horace Tabor, who had built a tower of mines and mortgages and opera houses on the single assumption that silver would always be money, watched that assumption erased by a vote in Washington he could not influence and had never imagined could touch him. He had spent 15 years certain that his luck was a kind of law. Now the law had changed, 2,000 miles away, in a room he would never enter, and the Silver King discovered all at once and far too late exactly how much of his empire had been borrowed against a metal he no longer owned. Chapter 10. The Crash. The end, when it came, was nearly total, and it came fast. The opera houses, the hotel, the bank, the marble Tabor block, the mansions in 2 cities, the scattered mines, all of it had been leveraged against silver, and when silver failed, the creditors came for everything at once. The Tabor Grand Opera House in Denver, the monument with his name in gold across the front, and the verse about the works of men fading painted on its curtain, was mortgaged and then surrendered. Building by building, claim by claim, the empire was sold out from under him to cover debts that no income remained to pay. Within a few years of the crash, Horace Tabor, lately among the richest men in the United States, owned almost nothing at all. He did not take it as a beaten man. At 65, an age when the wealthy of his era retired to their verandas, Horace Tabor went back underground. He took work as a common-day laborer in the Leadville mines, swinging a pick for wages in the rock he had once owned by the hillside, and moved his wife and daughters into a boarding house. For a time, the family lived in a single room at the Windsor Hotel, the same fashionable Denver house where, 20 years before, he had kept his beautiful new wife in luxury. He had come the whole circle, from the back of a grocery store to a seat in the Senate, and back down to a miner's wage, and he met the fall with a stubbornness that was almost dignity. He never stopped believing the luck would return. He chased it as far as Mexico, spending long months away from his family after one more strike that never came, while Baby Doe held what remained together in Denver and ran his affairs in his absence. The society that had waited for her to abandon him the instant the money vanished waited in vain. She stayed. Among the letters that survive from those hard years is one in her own hand that answers by itself every sneer ever aimed at her. "I cannot live one day without seeing you, my own true love." The grasping schemer of the legend had turned out to be the most loyal person in the story. In the end, he was kept from the streets by old friends. Some lent him money through the lean years after the crash, and in 1898 a few of his political allies arranged one last piece of dignity, an appointment as postmaster of Denver at a salary of $3,700 a year. The man who had given the city an opera house now sorted its mail. He held the post barely 15 months. In April of 1899, Horace Tabor died of appendicitis 68 years old, and very nearly penniless. Whatever the drawing rooms of Denver had decided about him, the city itself had not forgotten what he had built for it. Flags flew at half-staff, and an estimated 10,000 people came to mourn the fallen Silver King. And on his deathbed, by the account that has come down ever since, he turned to Baby Doe and told her to hold on to the Matchless Mine. It will make millions again when Silver comes back. He meant it as love, and it was the cruelest thing he ever gave her. For the Matchless, by then, had almost certainly already slipped from his hands, mortgaged or sold off like all the rest, a played-out hole in the ground that would never again yield $1. He had left his widow a worthless mine and a sacred order to keep it. She was 44 years old, with 2 daughters and nothing else, and she would obey that order for the next 36 years. And the other woman in Horace Tabor's life, the careful wife he had cast aside to marry her, had by then been 4 years in her grave, having come to an end so completely opposite that it reads almost like a verdict handed down by some colder court. Chapter 11. The Wife. He discarded. Augusta Tabor did not fade when Horace let her go. She kept his name, took the mansion and the property that the divorce had given her, perhaps $250,000, carved off an estate worth several million, and did with it what she had always done with whatever passed through her hands. She made it grow. The same frugality and shrewdness that her husband had come to find embarrassing turned out to be, in a falling market, the most valuable things anyone in the family possessed. While Horace poured silver into opera houses, Augusta made careful investments in Colorado and New Mexico real estate and quietly rebuilt a fortune of her own. She did not retreat into bitterness either. She gave to the Unitarian Church and devoted herself to the Pioneer Ladies' Aid Society, a charity she had helped found back in 1860, in the first lean year of the marriage. In the early 1890s, she let go of the great house on Broadway and moved into the new Brown Palace Hotel, where her son Maxie was among the managers. For years, by her own admission, she nursed a hope that Baby Doe would tire of Horace once the money was gone, and that he would come back to her. She told a reporter she was building up her wealth partly to be able to care for him in his old age. She had misjudged her rival entirely. Baby Doe would never leave him. But the hope says something about Augusta that the legend of the nagging wife never allowed, which is that she loved him still. She had earned the right to an opinion about the fortune, and once, to a Denver newspaper, she gave it plainly. I feel that in those early years of self-sacrifice, hard labor, and economy, I laid the foundation for Mr. Tabor's immense wealth, she said. Had I not stayed with him and worked by his side, he would have been discouraged, returned to the stone-cutting trade, and so lost his big opportunity. It was not a boast. It was the simple truth, and everyone in Colorado who remembered the early camps knew it. Late in 1894, a cough settled into her chest and would not leave. Hoping the warmth would help, she traveled to Pasadena, California, and there, in January of 1895, the cough having deepened into pneumonia, Augusta Tabor died at the age of 62. She left an estate of well over $1 million, by some accounts half again as much, which made her one of the wealthiest women in Denver, and she left more than half of it to her son. The arithmetic of the 3 lives is its own kind of judgment. Augusta, the wife cast off as an embarrassment, died in 1895, worth more than $1 million and respected to the end. Horace, who had thrown her over for a younger and brighter life, died 4 years later with almost nothing. And Baby Doe, the beauty for whom the whole scandal had been dared, would die 40 years after that, found frozen on the floor of a mining shack. The plain, frugal, discarded first wife had outlasted them both in every way the world measures security, and she had done it on her own with the very habits her husband had been ashamed of. For a century afterward, popular history would remember Augusta as the cold and nagging spouse who could not keep her man. Only lately has she been seen for what the record always showed, the toughest and most capable of the three, and the one who actually built the thing the others spent. It is a hard thing to judge, and viewers will judge it differently. Some will hold that Augusta was the only wise one of the three. Others will say that Baby Doe's refusal to leave him, even into ruin, was the finest thing in the whole story. Others still will conclude that Horace got no worse than he had earned. Say which of them you side with in the comments below. That leaves the third of them, the one the cameras and the operas have always loved best, the one who got the silver and the scandal and the legend and, in the end, the cruelest portion of all. Horace was buried, the mourners went home, and Baby Doe Tabor gathered her 2 daughters and her dead husband's final instruction and went back up the mountain, to Leadville, to the worthless mine she had been ordered never to sell. Chapter 12. The Matchless cabin was a single room, 12 feet by 16, that had begun its life as a tool shed at the mouth of the mine. To this, Baby Doe Tabor brought her 2 daughters in the years after Horace's death, and to this, once the daughters were grown and gone, she clung alone 2 miles above the sea on the bare flank of Friar Hill, guarding a hole in the ground her husband had sworn would pour out millions again. It never did. The silver did not come back in her lifetime, nor ever on the terms he had imagined. But she had been told to hold on, and holding on slowly became the entire content of her life. The descent was long and was watched. The best-dressed woman in the West, who had married a president's wedding guest in $7,000 of satin, grew old in mended clothes and wrapped her feet in burlap sacks against the cold. She refused charity wherever it was offered, mortgaged the claim, sold off the last of the famous jewels, and fought in court to keep her grip on a mine that owed her nothing. The people of Leadville saw a strange old woman in rags climbing to a shack on the hill, muttering, "Alone," and they drew the obvious conclusion. They began to call her the Mad Woman of the Matchless. She was not mad. She had become intensely religious, a devout Catholic who filled cheap notebooks with her dreams and visions and memories, and she carried her poverty with a pride that looked, from the outside, like derangement. In 1932, when a Hollywood studio made a film of the Tabor story and offered her $1,000 merely to appear at its premiere, she turned the money down flat. When she died, a Denver newspaper man who had watched her for years tried to set the record straight, writing that she was not eccentric. Her mind was still strong and hard. She had simply decided, long before, who she would be, and the loss of the fortune had not changed it. She had been proud when the silver was piling up at thousands of dollars a day, and she was exactly as proud when she had nothing but a cabin and an order to keep it. Set the vigil down in plain figures, and it becomes almost unbearable to read. 36 years she kept it. A shack 12 feet by 16. An elevation above 10,000 feet, where the winter runs past May and the night cold can kill a healthy man. More than 3 decades without an income, Every offer of help refused, including $1,000 merely to walk into a theater. And at the end, a woman of 81, alone on a frozen mountain, guarding a mine that had been worthless for a generation because a dying man had once told her to. The end came in the first days of March, 1935, in the middle of a blizzard. When the storm broke and no smoke had risen from the cabin for some time, neighbors climbed the hill and forced the door. They found baby doe Tabor on the floor, frozen, her arms folded across her chest, the fire long dead beside her. She was 81 years old, and she had outlived her husband by 36 years, every one of them spent within sight of the mine he had ordered her never to sell. What she left behind was not silver. It was a cabin full of cheap notebooks, the scrapbooks and dream books of half a century, the pressed flowers around the note about a baby boy with dark, curly hair, and a wedding dress that had cost a fortune in a vanished world. In time, those papers would be carried down the mountain and into a state archive, and the legend would begin its long second life. But baby doe was not quite the last of the Tabors to pay for the silver. There were still the two daughters, the children the fortune had been poured over, Lily and the one they had named for the metal itself. The crash had not finished with the family when it took the parents. It reached down, as such things do, into the next generation, and what it did to the girl called Silver Dollar is, in its own way, the darkest turn in the entire story. Chapter 13. Silver Dollar. The two girls had been born into a fortune that treated them like silver itself. Lily, the elder, was christened in a gown that cost $15,000, with a diamond pinning her diaper, and the family rolled through Denver and Leadville behind 4 horses in gold-mounted harness. Then, while they were still children, the bottom fell out of the metal that had paid for all of it, and the rest of their lives became a long argument with that loss. The two daughters answered it in opposite ways, and neither way ended well. Lily, old enough to remember the wardrobes and the toys, never forgave the fall. At 15, she refused to go on living in a tool shed on the side of Friar Hill. She borrowed train fare from an uncle, went east to Wisconsin to live with her grandmother, and cut off her mother and sister entirely. She married, lived quietly, and let the name Tabor fall away behind her. When word reached her, 3 decades later, that an old woman had been found frozen in a cabin at the Matchless, Lily declined to claim the body. She said the woman was not her mother. The more golden the childhood had been, the more total the erasure. She had chosen, in the end, to come from nowhere at all. Silver Dollar went the other way, named, by the family story, for the very metal that made and unmade them. She spent her life trying to climb back to a glamour she had been too young to keep. She wrote poems and a lurid little novel, took small parts in silent pictures, and filed for the Denver papers, and when none of it lifted her, she drifted to Chicago and into its underworld. There were aliases, one after another, a string of disreputable men, and a deepening reliance on drink and drugs, until the daughter of the Silver King was a chorus girl and a gangster's mistress in a city that did not know her name. At some point, frightened, she wrote a warning on the back of a suitor's photograph. "In case I am killed, arrest this man, for he will be directly or indirectly responsible for my death." The warning was not idle. In 1925, in a cheap Chicago boarding house, living under the name Ruth Norman, Silver Dollar Tabor was found scalded to death. She was 35. Whether it was a drunken accident with a kettle of boiling water, or, as others insisted, a killing made to look like one, was never established and never will be. The girl named for a silver dollar died penniless and anonymous, half a continent from the mountain her father's fortune had come out of. The news climbed back to the cabin on Friar Hill, and Baby Doe would not take it in. She told anyone who asked that the dead woman in Chicago was a stranger, that her silver had entered a convent and was safe with God. "I did not see the body they said was my little girl," she said, and she held to it for the 10 years of life left to her. Perhaps she believed it. Perhaps it was the only mercy available to a woman who had already lost a husband, a fortune, an infant son, and now a grown daughter to the same slow unraveling. Either way, it was nearly the last thing the silver did to the Tabors. When Baby Doe herself was found frozen in 1935, the family that had blazed across Colorado for one golden decade was, for every practical purpose, gone. The dynasty had lasted barely 2 generations, and it had ended in a Chicago rooming house and a frozen cabin a short climb above the gulch where the fortune was first dug. What outlived all of them was the place. The mountain was still there, and the mine, and the opera houses, and the wedding dress, and above all the story, which had only just begun, the long second life that would carry the Tabor name far past the silver that made it. What Leadville and the state of Colorado would do with that inheritance, and what the boomtown itself became after the metal ran out, is the last chapter of the empire of acres the Tabors built and lost. Chapter 14. Cloud City Falls. Leadville did not die when the silver died, but it came close, and it was never again what it had been. The town that claimed more than 30,000 souls in 1880 fell to 12,000 by 1900 and to 7,000 by 1910, the mines abandoned, the hills left scarred and bare. A few winters after the crash, the desperate residents tried to save the town with a spectacle. In the winter of 1895, they built an ice palace, a fairy tale fortress of more than 8,000 tons of ice, with 90-foot towers, 2 ballrooms, and a skating rink covering 3 acres on a hill above the failing town, and 250,000 people came to see it. Then the spring came, and the whole shining thing melted into the mud, having lost money the town could not spare. It was a perfect accidental monument to the boom that made Leadville dazzling, enormous, and gone almost as fast as it rose. What finally saved the town was the metal it had once thrown away. The base ores the silver men had ignored, zinc and lead, and later molybdenum from the Climax mine up the pass, kept Leadville alive through the 20th century. And the figures the hill gave up across its whole long life still stagger. Before it was finished, the Leadville district produced more than 240 million ounces of silver, nearly 3 million ounces of gold, 1 million tons of lead, 750,000 tons of zinc, and 50,000 tons of copper. The richest hill in America had been, by any measure, exactly that. It had also been a forge for fortunes far larger than the Tabors. Meyer Guggenheim laid the first stone of one of the great fortunes of the world in Leadville's mines and smelters. A young woman named Margaret Brown came up through the camp on her husband's mining luck, moved to Denver, and went on to survive the Titanic as the unsinkable Molly Brown. The boomtown that broke the Silver King quietly minted dynasties that would outlast him by a century. It left something darker behind as well. 100 years of digging and smelting had poured lead and arsenic and acid into the ground and into the headwaters of the Arkansas River, and in 1983, after a local rancher reported that the river had turned orange and was sickening his cattle, the federal government declared California Gulch and the town around it a Superfund site, one of the first in the nation. Cleaning up the silver boom's poison has taken more than 40 years, and the work is not finished yet. The metal that built the fortune is still in the water, being filtered out a little at a time, long after the last of the Tabors went into the ground. As for the Tabors themselves, the country has turned them into a place to visit. The Matchless Mine still stands above Leadville, its weathered head frame and hoist house intact, and beside it the tool shed cabin where Baby Doe was found, frozen, has been restored. Plank floor and potbelly stove for the tourists who climb the hill. The opera house she and Horace built still opens its doors. The $7,000 wedding dress is conserved in a Denver museum, and her cabin notebooks rest in a state archive. But the grandest monument of all, the Tabor Grand Opera House in Denver, the one with his name in gold and the verse across its curtain, was torn down in 1964, and a branch of the Federal Reserve Bank, a temple of the very gold-backed money that had destroyed him, was raised on the spot. The famous curtain, with its lines about how the works of men fade like a dream, was rolled into storage, where it slowly rotted and was finally hauled to the dump. The verse had come true to the letter, on its own painted cloth. Horace Tabor lies today in a Denver cemetery, and beside him at last is Baby Doe, the two of them together in the ground, as they were stubbornly together in life. Augusta rests apart, as she had lived apart. The wife who built the fortune kept her head, and died respected and wealthy, while the others fell. The three of them are the whole of the story. The man who mistook a lucky strike for a law of nature. The woman who loved him past all reason and all ruin. And the woman he cast aside, who turned out to understand everything he never did. They had everything the American ground could give: 2 opera houses, a seat in the Senate, a president at the wedding, and the richest hill on the continent, and inside a single generation the same ground took all of it back, and left a frozen cabin, a poisoned river, and a verse on a rotting curtain that had told them the whole time exactly how it would end. And one question outlasts all the others. For 36 years, Baby Doe Tabor guarded a worthless mine because a dying man had asked her to. Some will see in that the truest love in the whole story. Others will see a life thrown away on a dead man's instruction. Tell us in the comments which it was, and if you are descended from the Tabors, or grew up in Leadville, or have stood at that cabin yourself, write down what you carry. The histories never kept it, the comments can.